Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. In a remarkable new New York Times piece, journalist Adam Intus provides the untold story of America's hidden role in the war in Ukraine. He describes how Washington was woven into the war far more intimately and broadly than previously understood, support that extends beyond the provision of military equipment to include direct involvement in military planning, intelligence collection that guided big picture battle strategy and funneled precise targeting down to Ukrainian soldiers in the field, and the conduct of covert operations in support for strikes inside Russia itself. And it documents the strains and fissures that emerged between US and Kyiv as the war dragged on. Fast forward to today, and it is clear that under the Trump administration, US support to Ukraine is no longer guaranteed. President Trump's pause on aid and intelligence to Ukraine in March may have been brief, but it sent a clear message to Europe and Ukraine that the US may no longer be a reliable partner for Ukraine. As we've discussed on this podcast before, a reduction or end to US support for Ukraine could have a significant impact on the conflict dynamics in Ukraine and present a challenge for European allies as to whether they can step up and fill the gap. So today, we are in for an excellent discussion that will both look back and provide a firsthand account of the evolution of US assistance to Ukraine, as well as look forward at how a united Europe can help Kyiv keep up the fight. And there is, of course, no one better positioned to have this discussion than Celeste Wallander, the former Assistant Secretary for Defense for International Security Affairs, who played a critical role in coordinating U.S. support for Ukraine during the Biden administration. Celeste, welcome.
Thanks so much, Andrea and Jim. It's great to be with you.
As I mentioned, Celeste was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and we are, of course, very happy to have her here at CNAS, also as part of our team as an adjunct senior fellow. Also, one quick note before we get into our discussion, I'd like to let listeners know that next week, Brussels Sprouts will be on spring break. And so we will skip 1 week of recording. So we'll leave you on this tasty note before we resume the following week. So I was thinking, Celeste, about how we should start and delve into our discussion. And I might actually bring up one of our typical ending questions that tend to be more kind of self-reflective and contemplative, and put it right up at the front and just ask you, just for your general reflections on how you think the US did in support for Ukraine. I guess I'll just really leave it as you kind of are several months now distanced from that really intense experience. Kind of what do you reflect on? How do you think the US did?
Thanks. And it's the question we often get, those of us who served in the Biden administration. And there have been a fair number of points of criticism. And I think those points are fair, but what I would answer, or what I would like listeners to understand, is that the goal and the immediate focus of all of our security assistance was always driven by what the Ukrainians told us their needs were in the moment. And those needs and requirements and the shape of the battle and the battlefield changed over time. So in February 2022, no one could have predicted, for example, the scale of the Russian assault on Ukrainian critical infrastructure, and in particular energy infrastructure, that began in the winter of 2022. And so the ability to help Ukraine with air defense capabilities, which we did do once that became an immediate challenge, because Russia was getting assistance from Iran in deploying a new generation of very effective surveillance, but also strike UAVs against Ukrainian battlefield capabilities, but also infrastructure. If we had invested in that in, say, February or March of 2022, we would not have had the funding and the ability to help with what Ukraine needed immediately in February and March of 2022, which was to drive back Russian forces from Kyiv out of Kharkiv, and the successes that were so extraordinary for Ukraine in the early months. So it's impossible to tell the story of how Ukraine was assisted, how Ukraine fought this fight, in the abstract and only in retrospect. It was, as all wars are, an evolving and a changing environment. And as the US military always says, the enemy gets a vote. And so it wasn't a static situation, it was a constantly evolving situation. So, as you think about the different kinds of security assistance that the United States and the coalition of over 50 countries put together for Ukraine over time, it evolved in response to the battlefield requirements, but also it evolved in response to the Ukrainians coming to us and telling us what they were missing and what they needed to achieve.
If you go back to the early days of February 22 and maybe even a little bit before, I mean, it was, I think, the US assessment that Kyiv would fall very quickly. Do you think that again, in hindsight, changed what the US was willing to do in the earliest days for Ukraine? If there was this overarching assumption that it was just a matter of time before Ukraine was overrun by Russia, then it might really limit what we were willing to do, to give, to provide in order to help them. So when you look back on like that intelligence piece and just this broad, I think kind of far, widely accepted at the time assessment that it was that Ukraine would be quickly overrun. How do you think that affect dynamics inside the government and views amongst different principals or different agencies about what we should do?
Well, the scenario that appeared most likely from the intelligence and the assessment of Russian capabilities and Ukrainian capabilities at the time was that the Russians were going to strike at Kyiv and, were going to seek to decapitate the Ukrainian government, to get rid of the leadership, not just President Zelensky, but the entire Ukrainian leadership, and install their own puppet government. That was Putin's goal for a decade, to have a leadership in Kyiv that he could control and that was answerable to him. In the past, he had done it through, manipulating elections and influence operations and corrupt relationships. None of those were working because the Ukrainians were too resilient. They're too much of a democracy, and Ukrainian civil society and voters were not, fooled by that. So the determination on the part of the Kremlin was to seize the capital and to get rid of the government. And so the focus
offered Zelensky the ride, right? That was the famous line, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition.
Right, because the focus was to prevent Putin from succeeding.
Yeah.
How do you prevent Putin from succeeding in what looked like the most scenario facing the world in February was to support a government in exile and to preserve the legitimately elected democratic leadership of Ukraine, President Zelensky, to create that ability for a government in exile, whether that would have been an exile in Western Ukraine, in the area of Lviv, which was pretty remote from Russian abilities to invade that far, or whether you had to do something like was done in World War II. Remember, in World War II, there were a number of governments in exile that never caved in. So those countries never technically caved in to Nazi rule. And those governments were able to organize resistance, organize military forces. I'm thinking of Poland, but also France. And that was a historic example that had some resonance, also with Ukrainians. So Ukrainians were part of the talking about how would you cope with a Russian decapitation operation in Kyiv and not let Putin succeed. So that ended up not being the scenario, because a combination of incredible innovation and cleverness on the part of, and determination on the part of Ukrainian military and civilian forces, but also Um, we did make a mistake, I will say. Since you asked me to start out with what did we get wrong, we paid too much attention, I think, to the flashy Russian military exercises where they were able to achieve those kinds of lightning strikes, where they were able to do that kind of combined arms, extraordinary strike into a country and seize the capital. Those were the scenarios in multiple Zapad exercises and other special exercises that the Russians had been doing for years. And we kind of knew all along that a lot of that was set piece and a lot of it was theater, and we probably should have taken that more seriously. That the Russians were making themselves look stronger than they actually were, partly for their internal audience. But then again,
Sure.
what you do when you do military planning, either for yourself or for a partner, is you have to assume the worst. It's easy to assume the best, but then if the worst actually happens, you're not ready for it. And so we assumed the worst, and the Ukrainians assumed the worst, which is there would be a really tough fight in Kyiv, and it just turned out not to be the case.
Hi, Celeste. Great to see you again, and welcome to Brussels Sprouts. One of the complaints that we heard from Ukraine, some criticism too, earlier on, was as the Allies began to increase training of Ukrainian troops, whether bringing them into the UK or Sweden, we were doing a lot as well. That after a while, the Ukrainians were saying, "You're not training us in the right way. You're training us for something that we don't do." And this was particularly for during the time. I think it got louder as we were getting ready for the big offensive. And there was this complaint that we were training them as if they were us, with a lot of air support and helos and the ability to break through barriers and this type of thing. And so there was this kind of back and forth, at least that we heard, that maybe we had to rethink what kind of training Ukraine really needed, and were we giving them stuff that just wasn't appropriate? Did you all hear that as well? Was that a thing that was a problem that was corrected over time, or was that really just stuff on the outside, a lot of static on the outside that really was not, in fact, the case as we were working and training Ukrainian forces?
Well, as Andrea mentioned at the top, the investigative article by Adam Entus, and as that article makes very clear, those plans for that counteroffensive were co-developed with the Ukrainians. This gets back to my point. This was their objective. This was their plan. This was and then developed because they didn't have, really the planning capability, then the resources and the experience. This was their objective to strike through the Russian lines and get to the Sea of Azov. So, I mean, that's the foundation for then the training for which, the United States had some role and some lead, and others participated. And the security assistance then we planned, the armor, the artillery, all the capabilities. So there was not some big surprise that there wasn't air support. There wasn't an air support capability for the Ukrainians at the time because it was a contested airspace, and the Ukrainians were dealing with a Russian air force and Russian strike capabilities that just denied them air superiority. At the same time, the Ukrainians had succeeded in denying the Russians air superiority, partly because of, again, their own innovation, but because of the capabilities that we had surged to them. So both air forces were out of the game in the summer of 2023 for that counteroffensive. And that was not a surprise. That was baked into the plan. So, we could go point by point, and I think it's a mistake to be defensive. And I'm not being defensive. I'm being very straightforward with you that outside Ukrainians complained about that. If they have a complaint about that, they need to go to their own military, because their own military knew exactly what capabilities were coming to them. They were the ones that had defined who would go to training, how they would train, and the United States agreed with that. I mean, we supported that. We weren't reluctant to do it. We thought it was a good plan. So I understand the concern that the Ukrainians were missing certain capabilities, but it is the case that generally you go to war with the military you have. Ukraine actually didn't end up having to go to the war with the military it had because we helped them build elements of a military that they didn't have in February 2022. But yes, they did not have everything that you would want to have against an opponent like Russia. But that's the sort of thing you have to build decades ahead of time and invest in ahead of time. And they hadn't had that opportunity. So the perfect is the enemy of the good. And maybe the plans and the capabilities that we helped Ukraine develop were not perfect, but they were what was doable in the moment. And the alternative would have not been perfect. The alternative would have been to do nothing. And that was not an acceptable alternative.
Can you talk a little bit more about how the US government helped Ukraine to build some of the capabilities? And I'm thinking of a quote in the New York Times piece that I thought was really great. I think it was Millie who said, "You've got a big Russian," and I'm not going to get it right. I don't have it in front of me, but the big Russian military and a smaller Russian military, which was Ukraine, in large part because they had built their militaries the same way. And if we let them continue as they will, it's not going to turn out well for Ukraine. And so we have to give them things that would give them a different kind of advantage. What did that conversation kind of look like? I just kind of trying to get more color around some of the thinking on the inside and some of the personalities who might have been shaping how this played out?
Yeah, I mean, the Russian way of war is the Soviet way of war, and it's incredibly effective, but it's incredibly resource intensive. If you go back and look at history and battles that the Soviets won against the German Wehrmacht were much the same way that they are fighting in eastern Ukraine. Masses of artillery barrages, but especially not maneuver warfare. And the Soviet way of war worked for them. They lost 27 million, citizens, not just soldiers, 27 million in the war. But it was worth it to them, and they had the resources to do that. They lost massive amounts of artillery. They lost massive amounts of aircraft, and they used extraordinary millions of rounds of artillery ammunition in defeating the German Wehrmacht and moving forward in World War II. The Ukrainians are a smaller country. They're a big country. They're the largest country in Europe. Their population is about a third of Russia's at this point. And they had stocks of capabilities, but they do not have, and they have advanced defense industrial production capabilities. The Ukraine was the heart of the Soviet missile and air defense production during the Cold War, and a lot of that technology remains in Ukraine. Tank factories in Kyiv, yes, but not the kind of massive space and capabilities to produce ammunition and artillery and aircraft in particular that Russia has. And so over time, if you fight the war the Russian way, Russia's going to be able to do that to some extent, although sanctions and export restrictions, defense technology restrictions were limiting that to some extent. But Ukraine was going to have trouble even with the assistance of the coalition. And that is kind of the thinking behind that famous quote from General Milley that was generally recognized by not just the US military, but European militaries. And so if you fight the way your enemy has an advantage, you're going to lose. And Ukraine did not have to fight that way because Ukraine had the advantage of advanced security assistance capabilities that we were surging to them. Ukraine had the advantage of NATO-style planning and warfare led by the United States, but also supported by other NATO countries who don't fight the Soviet way of war. And so it was looking for a way to create a disadvantage for the enemy, Russia, an advantage for our partner, the Ukrainians, that they eagerly sought as well, because they understood, well, this is the challenge. Some of the commanders understood that they could not win fighting the Russian way of war. But unfortunately, because, again, you're going to war with the military you have, a lot of the commanders, Ukrainian commanders, were old school and they were doing their best, but they had trouble adapting to that new style of war.
Well, thanks for that. That's that makes a lot of sense, and I think we were watching that from the outside as well. What was the interagency like working this issue over time? OSD, Joint Staff, UCOM, NSC staff. We certainly heard a lot about Jake and all of that. And then, of course, allies were part of that as well. They'd come over for meetings and they'd have their point of view on things, and DoD might have one view. And the whole interagency thing. How did that? What was it? I'm sure there was, it was bumpy every now and then, but on the whole, what was the interagency uh, atmosphere over time as you all were working these issues?
So early I mean, not just early, for pretty much the first year of the war, there were nearly daily deputies committee meetings to be able to coordinate on, not just security assistance, but financial assistance, diplomatic assistance, work at the UN. And so there was real time sharing of understanding of what on the battlefield the Ukrainians required and what we could bring together to support them and supply. And so, I mean, it was constant briefings and in a very constructive, useful way to kind of bring the interagency along. There were differences of views about certain capabilities over time. The Joint Staff and UCOM would give their best military advice not only to Secretary Austin and the OSD team, but would often brief directly to the deputies so they would understand. And sometimes the ideas that Ukrainian advocates were bringing from the outside to the NSC and to state had to get litigated and run through that best military advice. But in general, the driving force was UCOM, was the Joint Staff, was Secretary Austin's views on how to prioritize. Again, just so everyone understands, we had incredibly generous budgetary support from Congress, at least until the spring of 2024 when we had the delay. But it was a certain amount of money that we had to spend every month. And so there was a prioritization. What do the Ukrainians need now? What do we need to put on contract through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative? We don't have infinite funds. We have extraordinary funds, historic funds, but we have to pick and choose what do the Ukrainians most need and when do they most need it. And so there was a process of the US military explaining that to State Department and to NSC. They were often under a huge amount of pressure, public pressure, and the Ukrainians are very good. They know our politics. They have relationships on Congress, on the Hill. I got grilled quite often when I would go either in public or in classified briefings on why aren't you sending this or why aren't you sending that. But the alternative would be we wouldn't be an open, functional government. We would, just kind of DoD would do whatever it wanted to do, and no one thinks that's a good idea. So there was a lot of give and take. I mean, sometimes the military, U.S. military, would advise, and the Ukrainians would seek capabilities like cluster munitions that were politically challenging for the United States, both on the international stage and domestically. And so that had to get litigated. Sometimes the Ukrainians wanted things like F-16s in early 2022, which didn't make sense because it would take years to train pilots, and you would have had to pull Ukrainian pilots from operating MiG-29s and Sukhoi 25s, which were keeping the Russians out of the fight in 2022, the air fight. So it was a lot of give and take, and there was a lot of education. But I think that the commitment and the time commitment, the extraordinary time commitment of deputies to being briefed up, to really working it through, and to making sure that there wasn't just best military advice and civilian DoD advice, but also State Department buy-in and NSC buy-in and President Biden's guidance in the end was really important, and working with Congress as well.
Just to stay on this topic for a minute, from the outside, it often looked like the no, 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 yes, like, no, we won't give this. And there would be a no, 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 no. And then eventually the US would provide it. And I do hear you saying that what you were providing was calibrated to meet the demands that Ukraine had, and you were following their lead in terms of like what they needed and when. But can you talk about that dynamic? Because you'd be on TV and, oh, will the Biden administration ever provide the attack, or whatever it was. There was always a system du jour, and will they ever provide it? And the answer would be like, well, they're saying no right now, but the track record has been that eventually it might turn into a yes or something like that. So that's one part of the question. But then the other part is also, I hear you talking about kind of DOD's advice and the military advice and how they would brief the principals. But the other key theme that kind of was so prominent, at least in the outside external environment, was more of a political calculus, and particularly the concerns of escalation. We didn't want World War III, et cetera. It felt like there was a real risk aversion. And at least from the outside, that seemed to be coming more from the political side. I guess that's a question. Was that kind of restraint and a lot of the concerns about being drawn into the war and that it would be escalatory, was that coming more from the military side, or was that much more of a political decision?
So on the frame that there was reluctance and then eventually caving in, the frame is wrong. The frame is that I believe the frame is that, as I suggested, it's what do they need now? They don't need the high-end fancy stuff now. They need the basics in 2022. They needed to learn how to operate NATO style, NATO standard, basic artillery capabilities before they were going to be able to be ready to be trained on HIMARS, for example. They needed to learn how to immediately use their T-72 tanks and their legacy Soviet armored vehicles to fight today, while then, we begin to work with the Europeans to get them more advanced armored personnel carriers, armored vehicles, and NATO standard tanks. The part of the big piece of this, and I never served in the military, but I learned a lot. Anyone who served in the military knows you don't just like hop into a high-end tank and march to Moscow. You actually have to learn, you have to train on how to operate these capabilities. And NATO standard capabilities are very different from Soviet era. And the Ukrainians were incredibly quick to learn and motivated to learn, but it doesn't turn on overnight. So that's thing one. And there's a little bit of selection bias, and I can't get too into it, and probably everyone will fall asleep on the podcast if I go into it. The Ukrainians asked for a lot of things they never got. So the headlines, because either we didn't have them in our stocks to provide them, or there were technology transfer issues, which are serious and real. Remember, it was a battlefield, and the Ukrainians were fighting bravely, and sometimes they would lose equipment because the Russians would succeed in stopping them, and the Ukrainians would have to retreat. And so technology issues were a concern because the Russians then would gather up that capability and march it back for exploitation and study, and then figure out how to use that knowledge against maybe US or NATO forces in the future. So it was a delicate balance of what and when to provide capabilities to the Ukrainians. And as you get to the more advanced capability, there's a longer lead time in training, and not just training in the use, but in repair, maintenance, and sustainment on the battlefield. So that is the frame, I think, that does a better job of explaining timing that, and again, understanding the Ukrainians were asking us, and I do not blame them. They were asking for absolutely everything because they were desperately trying to save their country. And we did the best we could to get them what we thought they needed, to plan for that kind of training frame. But also, sometimes we just had to say no because we did not have sufficient stocks to be able to donate them.
Yeah.
On the escalation, the United States had a duty to prevent escalation. the notion that you're afraid of escalation, in every war, in every battle, in every conflict, leaderships manage escalation so that they can win. And I can't get more into much more detail than that here, but the notion that somehow it was, cowardly, you didn't say this, but others have, cowardly, or if it was fear of escalation, anything like that, you have a duty to control the terms of escalation so that you can, in this case, support a partner so that they aren't destroyed. And I think that the evidence is actually, the historic evidence is going to be that we as a coalition with Ukraine did a very good job of creating the time and space for Ukraine to actually be able to defend its country in the end. Now, is that changing now? I am concerned that is changing now, that Russia has the advantage in controlling escalation because the United States is indicating the limitations of its willingness to support Ukraine. But I don't think there is any indications that the Russians were controlling the terms of escalation from 2022 to January of 2025.
I know we're throwing like every criticism at you, and it's not meant to be overly critical of how the Biden administration handled it. But I think it's so important to give people the chance to respond so that people understand the fuller picture. So I'm going to give you one more of the really common criticisms. And then, Jim, I know you want to get in, which is that the Biden administration did just enough to keep Ukraine in the fight, but not enough to actually win. That was the other thing that you would hear. Like, we just kept them in it long enough so that they weren't overrun and defeated, but we didn't do enough to enable them to win. What did that look like from the inside? Or if that was even discussed?
Yeah, I can unequivocally smash that down. I never heard anyone in any of those meetings, including inside the Pentagon with EUCOM or with the NSC or state, say, let's just give them enough to keep on fighting. The challenge was they were fighting an incredibly powerful, capable, and determined enemy. And they were, again, fighting a country that had all kinds of advantages in its way of war. Once Russia had seized a significant amount of territory back in 2014 and 2015, and it held it. It had prepared defenses. It had the advantage of a huge front through which it could surge capabilities. It got the advantage of countries helping it with workarounds on sanctions and technology restrictions. And it has the advantage of being able to restart its defense industrial base 24/7. The counteroffensive was exactly designed to give Ukraine an advantage to put Russia on its back foot. Again, as you saw it read in the New York Times article, and it didn't work for various reasons. So that I absolutely can tell you, I never heard any principal, deputy, or anyone in the US government say, let's just give them enough to keep fighting. There was frustration that we weren't able to do more. There was heartbreak for every time one of their battles didn't work. And if we only wanted them to survive, we would have not provided them with the kind of capabilities that we built over time, including eventually that F-16 capability that they wanted early in the war.
Well, thanks. And like Andrea said, we're just, on the outside, we were doing a lot of media every night, for me at least, 2 or 3 times a night, broadcasting into Europe, broadcasting into Ukraine. I mean, it was really amazing. And we, of course, didn't have a whole lot to go on to try to explain to people what this was. So a lot of this is just, asking you what you would have said had you been asked by about 100 radio stations in the UK about my question right now, and that is the nuclear side. And we ought to touch on that. When I was asked about that, night after night, I would say, we don't panic. We take this seriously. We're watching them, blah, 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 blah. But one thing you did hear a lot, and we would have to address, was this idea of being self-deterred, which just became a new buzzword around town. That Biden himself was being self-deterred, that the nuclear saber would be rattled just a little bit by someone in Moscow, and that there would be a step back. And of course, that was exaggerated, and we said that. But that's now becoming a thing, I think, for the future too, as we have to deal with Russia, particularly in terms of their willingness to rattle a nuclear saber. Whereas in the past, except for the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was a bit of a taboo. But here, in a very upfront and scary way for a lot of people who don't deal in this stuff, and we're hearing it for the first time. That was something that was frightening. So this self-deter thing, I know what your answer is going to be, but just to put it on the table, what do you think about that as something certainly for the future? But the secondly is, we're in now a new place in terms of warfare, where we're going to have to deal with, whether it's low yield type of battlefield nuke that the Russians don't seem to mind using, and I mean, there's escalation that's part of that as well. But how, as we forget the past and we look towards the future, how do we go about thinking about dealing with that, where you're not being self-deterred, whether that actually happened or not, but you're not being self-deterred. You, in fact, are pushing back on that person rattling that nuclear saber and saying, well, you can rattle your saber at me, I'm going to rattle mine at yours. And we're going to have to just, really be hard asses on this. And if you're going to use a low yield, we will too. Just know that's going to happen. I mean, do you get to that kind of deterrent? Or how do we deal with that now, in the next crisis? And it could be with Russia. They might be doing that again. What would be another tactic to use so it doesn't look like you're being self-deterred?
Well, clearly we weren't self-deterred, because over the course of 3 years, the coalition in the United States delivered over $120 billion worth of security assistance. At this point, I believe the count is over. Russia has over 800,000 killed and wounded in the fight. We're heading towards 1 million soldiers, because Ukraine fought and because the coalition supported them. So self-deterred would have been to say, in February 2022, we don't want to help Ukraine kill Russians, which is what we did. Sorry to be brutal, but that's not self-deterred.
Right.
The point you ask about, though, is a really important point, which is people need to understand in Russian military doctrine under Putin, there is an explicit provision, and this has been written about publicly, for limited use of nuclear weapons to prevent loss in a conventional war. There's no such thing as a complete separation in the modern world between conventional military conflict and the specter of nuclear war. That's the point of nuclear weapons, and it was during the Cold War. The point of nuclear weapons is to deter an enemy from thinking that they can win war, including conventional war. During the Cold War, that was NATO's strategy, right? That's why we had forward deployment of nuclear weapons and the development of nuclear sharing, the whole process of nuclear sharing and dual capable aircraft, to create a credible threat for the Soviet Union that if it tried to win a conventional war in Europe, in fact, it would become a nuclear war, and the United States stood behind that with our strategic nuclear weapons. So deterrence is about both things, not one or the other. Now, circumstances have sort of flipped that on its head, where it is now the Russian Federation that needs to find, or believes it needs to find, credible ways to have limited nuclear options in order to stop a conflict with the United States and NATO, in order to prevent failure in a purely conventional war. Again, this has been written about generally. The Russians watched what the United States did in Afghanistan and what we did in Iraq, and what Europe and the United States did in Libya. And their takeaway from that, the takeaway in the United States is often, oh my God, those are disasters, and then they were forever wars. The Russian takeaway is, oh my God, the United States can execute a purely conventional intervention across the globe and win. And so the Moscow's nightmare scenario is if they get into a conventional conflict with the United States anywhere, but especially in Europe, they're going to get overwhelmed because of American global reach and conventional capabilities. And that is why in current Russian military doctrine and in current Russian military development, they create options for usable nuclear options, which you mentioned, low yield, tactical, but it goes all the way up to hypersonic missiles, to various new creative cruise missiles, ways to defeat American air defenses in order to assure the Kremlin itself that it has a credible threat of nuclear escalation in order to create the time and space for them to be able to execute conventional warfare. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that is an underappreciated aspect of this conflict. And then the scare in the fall of 2022 is an important element in that history and that understanding.
I know Jim
So
has a finger, so let me put one in too, just to hear your thoughts on why Russia ultimately didn't use nuclear weapons. I mean, lots of people have debated, oh, it's because China would pressure them or they risk losing that relationship. Or, I mean, there's been lots of different ideas about what the factors that were most important in shaping their decision calculus. So I'd be curious your thoughts. But Jim, go ahead and pile yours on.
no, go ahead, answer that, and then I've got just a follow up.
I think fundamentally because Putin was confident that he could eventually win in a conventional conflict, and he didn't want to take that step in that point in time.
Yeah.
And yes, sure, the public outing of the threat of the risk, the chance that Russia would actually step over that, some private messaging from a number of countries probably helped. But in the end, Putin is playing a long game, and he didn't feel the need to win in the fall of 2022 because he was increasingly confident that he had a longer run option. Again, by then he was beginning to get help from Iran and also China and other countries in working around sanctions. So the urgency of not losing was not there in the fall of 2022.
So my follow up is: so how do you devise a deterrent to keep him from using a low yield? Some people would say, well, he's got to know that if he's going to use it, we're going to use it too, immediately, and he's going to bear or there's got to be some other cost that he can be threatened with that would keep him from using a low yield. And you mentioned a couple of them there. What China does, he doesn't want to mess things up with China, et cetera, et cetera. But as we look into the future, as we think about the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, low yield, and I keep emphasizing low yield because there is a deterrent effect for the dirtier tactical weapons, where but when they become lower yield, there's more of a willingness to use it. At least, as you point out with the Russians in Western Europe, even if it's low yield, that's not going to work because it's not the U.S. that's going to be where these things go off. And so, how do you think about how we deter that? How do you deter the Russians from using that?
Well, if you step back and think about theories of deterrence, there's two basic answers to your really good question. One is you make it clear to the adversary that it's not going to work. So you signal in various ways that the stakes in the conflict are so significant that particular tactics to try to coerce the other party to stand down will not will not succeed.
And I think the Ukrainians did that very well, right? I mean, Zelensky was very clear about saying, even if you use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, we won't.
Exactly. You're exactly right. And that's a good example. It's not the only example, but it's a very, very good example. The other, the classic, Cold War example was, or tactic, one of the tactics was to put US military forces on the front line, right? So that you create the stake where the United States is not going to say, oh no, nuclear use, now we're going to have to, get out of this conflict. So there are different ways that you can signal and create a very real evidence that actually your adversary's stakes are not higher than yours are higher, and so it won't work for various reasons. The other, and there's not a complete difference between these two, but the other is to raise costs on the adversary. And I wouldn't rule out reciprocal or symmetrical responses, but I think and you're not saying this, Jim, but I want to highlight, there's too quick of an idea that you have to go symmetrical or reciprocal. What should be driving your response options is what was painful to the adversary and what could you credibly deliver. And Jim, you pointed to this. Would it really be, it's challenging enough in the NATO context to look at, limited nuclear use options, but for various reasons. So you're doing limited, it raises questions, is the United States really committed to Europe if you're talking about limited use, because you don't want to use your strategic weapons? There's a whole history of this. And there's also, wait a minute, we don't want tactical nuclear weapons deployed on European territory. So the credibility of that kind of capability may not make it easily available as a NATO strategy. And so you have to look at what would be credible politically as well as militarily. And dual capable aircraft is one solution to that. That was developed, during the Cold War and continues to be an element of NATO's strategy. But also what I want to highlight is you figure out what is painful to the adversary. And I'm not sure that reciprocal nuclear use would be all that painful for Putin.
Right. I agree.
Too. And so you got to literally hit him where he lives.
Yeah.
And so I don't have a specific, sort of menu of tactics that or responses that I would lay out here, partly because, they need to be classified, but it's the framework, I think, that is most important for people to understand. What is painful and costly to the adversary? And hopefully that will deter that first limited use. But if it happens, you have to be ready then to execute on imposing those costs.
Yeah.
I could ask you 1,000 questions. But on that, kind of hit them where they live. We did see Ukraine at various times trying to strike into Russia, even before all of the attackums and all of that, but with the drone strikes on Moscow and other things. And oftentimes, or at least it was my observation, and the thinking from the Ukrainians was, we have to increase the cost. We have to bring the war to Russians so that they feel it a different way. Then maybe that starts to create more uncertainty about how long Russia should stay in the war, et cetera. But did it have the inadvertent effect of rallying people around Putin? Like, you're telling us you're at war with the Ukrainians, and now we understand that. We feel it, that's sometimes the hard thing with attacks on kind of hit them where they live, is it has that effect of rallying the population around Putin. Yeah. But I don't know, like around that period of time, like how was the US thinking about those kinds of strikes and those tactics?
So it's a great question. And I'll say, I will speak for myself. I was really skeptical early on for a couple of reasons. One is that the Ukrainian UAV capabilities early on were not particularly accurate, and that's not a criticism. It's it just was the capability at the time, and you need a high level of accuracy to have really significant impact on things other than sort of the sides of buildings and things like that. And secondly, they tended to be the kind of off the shelf, small kind of great battlefield story of these tiny little UAVs, but they weren't going to really knock anything out.
Yeah.
And So I didn't think that it was going to be, and then you get the whole thing about Putin controlling the media and, all this sort of thing. As the Ukrainian capability, so I was a skeptic, and I thought exactly what I was more concerned that the Ukrainians were creating, unfortunately for themselves, a completely unfair, but a potential moral equivalency, because there was a lot of support for Ukraine because of seeing, for example, Mariupol destroyed, for seeing schools hit by Russian missiles, seeing civilians killed, a maternity hospital, for God's sakes. And I was concerned that some of the international political support that was so important for what we were doing on security assistance for Ukraine could get shaken by that. The Russians, as you know, are so good at playing the false moral equivalence to their advantage. And it just didn't feel like it was worth it. As Ukrainian drone technology and skills and capability have improved, their accuracy, their reach, and the ability of those UAVs to carry heavy payloads and really do damage increased. And what we have saw in 2024 and are seeing now, actually, to me, my argument, not that the Ukrainians need to listen to me and not that they are listening to me anymore, is they're winning that cost benefit balance. And we've seen that in Putin's willingness, in theory, to agree to a limited ceasefire on critical energy infrastructure, because the Ukrainians have gotten really good at disrupting and destroying some of Russia's critical infrastructure, not quite on the scale that the Russians have. Also, the Ukrainians are developing cruise missiles. So it's not just UAVs. And so the Russians have got to take seriously that the Ukrainians have their own reach and their own increasing accuracy and also payload power to be able to do some real damage. And so I think it evolved during the course of the conflict, and the Ukrainians are actually in a position where they can credibly hold at risk Russian assets.
Yeah, that strikes on like logistics hubs, energy. Yeah, that feels that different than kind of like you're saying, those earlier attacks that inside Moscow and others. Yeah, but that's been really important.
Just this, I know we're running out of time, and this is probably more in the bin of introspection, philosophical question. But why do you think deterrence failed in 2022? I mean, we all went to the mat, both inside and outside. But Putin went ahead and crossed into Ukraine, and we have what we have. Why do you think deterrence failed?
I'm not convinced that deterrence failed. The United States exposed what the Russians were doing and getting ready to do, but I think maybe political deterrence failed, but there was no military threat against Russia from the United States or from Europe. So, and this, this, of course, this is a small consolation to the Ukrainians. They weren't a member of NATO. The U.S. Article 5 did not cover Ukraine. I don't remember any U.S. or European leaders saying that their countries would go to war if Russia invaded Ukraine. So political deterrence failed, I guess, and maybe economic threats of sanctions failed. But sometimes deterrence fails because the adversary is willing to pay the costs, or you could argue that it wasn't credible. I don't think the Russian leadership fooled itself that it wasn't going to be subject to sanctions and some kind of political costs. It was worth it to them. But you could argue politically and economically, to the extent there was deterrence threats, that maybe that failed. But it failed because taking control of Ukraine was more important to Putin than suffering some sanctions and some bad votes in the UN General Assembly. He knew he could stop anything in the Security Council. But there was no military threat that if Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States will go to war against Russia. So it isn't, again, not being defensive. It's a fact. There wasn't a failure of military deterrence, and that wasn't in the cards, and it still isn't in the cards. It wasn't just in 2022. We were never going to go to war on behalf of Ukraine. President Biden made that clear at the beginning. There were 4 objectives: that that to defend protect the American homeland, to have NATO remain unified and in fact become more unified as a result of Russia's aggression, that Ukraine would remain a sovereign and independent country, and this would end in a strategic failure for Russia. Nowhere in that was it ever articulated that, and in fact, the war between Russia and the United States over Ukraine would have violated the first two of those objectives.
Well, that's interesting. I think there's a lot more to be explored on trying to answer this question. I know I understand what you're saying absolutely, and I think we also didn't signal or somehow make the Russians understand that this was an important national security issue for us. In other words, we didn't. I mean, sure. I mean, we had the goods on them. We went around Europe to NATO, telling everybody this is getting ready to happen. We gotta, so we were certainly playing a role, but it wasn't one maybe where if this was really important to us. Not that, again, your point about the military side of it is important, but that shouldn't be what deterrence is all about. There's got to be another deterrence aspect too. One of the criticisms we heard, or not criticism, but a debate was maybe you need to put the sanctions on before. You don't wait for the deterrence to fail and then put on sanctions. So there's a debate about that kind of thing. But to me, I understand what you're saying, but I think there's still something else that's out there, because certainly the Russians looked us right in the eye and said, "Get out of my way," and and that's got to mean something. And it shouldn't be, the option shouldn't be limited to, well, if you're going to deter him, it's got to be military. I mean, I understand the importance of that, and I understand that's the only thing he listens to. But as you look at trying to keep a nation state from invading someone else, they're not an ally, but if they look you in the eye like Putin did and say, "Please get out of my way and let me do what I want to do here," that certainly is a blow against the U.S., or it hurts the U.S., or it's a sign that the U.S. isn't able to stop bad things from happening, or something along those lines. I just think it's something for us to think about, that we are unable to stop this from happening. And part of it too, I think, was Europe. It wasn't like the European allies were lining up. No one wanted to go to war. There was a lot of self-deterrence, as they would say, going on. And I think Putin brushing us aside, that part of it, before the invasion, as everybody and their neighbor was going to Moscow to talk to Putin, that at the end of the day, he brushed, and I guess I should really put it this way, he didn't brush the U.S. aside as much as he brushed the West aside, including the United States. He said, "All of you, get out of my way." And in he went. And so I think it's worth looking back at that and saying, what could we have done wrong besides sending in the 82nd Airborne? What could we have done? What do you think about that?
Well, I guess maybe I think the point that you're making is a really important one because it bears on Ukraine's future security.
Yeah.
Like
Sure
Celeste,
does.
when you were talking, that it was the case that we were very clear that we were never going to go to war for Ukraine, and neither were the Europeans. And so the question now is, if we put a European force inside Ukraine now, is it credible that they would go to war now to protect Ukraine? I mean, I think that's something that we're all grappling with. So Putin understood before the US and Europe weren't willing to go to war over Ukraine. And so are we willing to now? And that's, it really gets at the crux of what kind of security guarantee we are going to provide Ukraine.
That deters Russia.
Yeah. So first, just observe, if you'd put sanctions on before they invaded, that wouldn't be deterrence, that would be coercive use of sanctions, and that's fine. And you would have never gotten the Europeans on board, so you wouldn't have had a credible. Again, it comes back to, sort of what is deterrence. It's got to be credible, and it wouldn't be credible because you just wouldn't have worked. But I do think that if you look back at mistakes going back to 2014, we should have used sanctions as an escalating pressure. What we tended to do was do new sanctions when the Russians did bad things. But what we should have done is consider a strategy, since there's a lessons learned aspect here, and it applies to 2022 to 2025 too, which is, for every month, Russia, you don't end this war, we're going to sanction something else. Instead, they get used to it. They normalize it. They find workarounds, and that becomes less painful over time. And so, as a strategy of deterrence in statecraft, finding a way to undermine the adversary, in this case, Putin's sense that I can wait this out. As the pain grows more over time, it might be a more effective strategy. So I'd throw that out there. On I admire the Europeans so much for taking up maybe our dropped banner. The United States has dropped the banner of leading on Ukraine because that's where this administration's preference is, and the Europeans have picked that up on security assistance, on diplomatic support, and now looking at a force to support a peace settlement. My concern is that people don't. I used to teach courses on like peacekeeping and things like that. The necessary condition for a peacekeeping force is that the peacekeeping force is to prevent confusion or temptation to cheat.
Mm-hmm.
Peacekeeping forces do not have the mission of enforcing the peace.
Yeah.
They are never equipped, nor do they have the mandate to defend the wronged party. So I hear a lot of commentary where the sense is that the Europeans are going to deploy to Ukraine, and then if the Russians start something, the Europeans will, be in the fight. That's not what a peacekeeping force is, and they won't be equipped to do that. And I don't think that's what the Europeans have in mind. So what is the context for a European force? It is basically to prevent misperception, an incident escalating, to kind of dial it back down when both parties really do want the peace settlement. And my concern is that I don't think Putin wants a peace settlement yet that is on terms acceptable to Ukraine or to Europe. And I am a little worried that people are going to put the Europeans in a bad place because they're going to maybe deploy this force, and then the Russians are going to exploit it, and everyone's going to say to the Europeans, well, why aren't you defending Ukraine? And so we need to be clear about what a force like this could be or would not be in order to not be back here in 3 years, Jim, talking about, the Europeans failing to defend Ukrainians when that was never actually the mission. And
Right.
It's not a good answer to how do you move forward, but it is an important part of the answer about how can Europe be able to build the capability, the military capability and the political capability for credible defense if and when someday Putin decides to come after NATO.
Well, I think we didn't really do, we brushed the surface only of the forward-looking piece. And because I know you've written on this in Foreign Affairs and you've got something else coming out. But so we didn't really do the forward-looking piece as we guaranteed our listeners, but the retrospective, I think, was too important to cover. And it was really a rich discussion, Celeste. It was so helpful to hear your views and perspectives and what the decisions look like, the debates look like from the inside. It's such an important piece of this. And I think this has been a really valuable contribution to how we understand the last, 3 years now of this war. So thank you for joining us. And now we'll have to bring you back to do the forward-looking piece.
Although I would like to go back to 2014, frankly. And I've got a lot to say on that, as Andrea knows. I won't spin myself up on that. Celeste, you were not in OSD policy when this was going on in 2014, and I think you had gone elsewhere. But boy, there's a lot of fingers that should be pointed to a lot of our friends. I won't get into it. Anyway,
okay, keep the powder dry, Jim.
At some point, I would love to go back to 2014 and start with basics and then go on from there.
Yeah, well, elsewhere where I was in 2014 was actually at the NSC and at the White House. So I would love to have that conversation.
Let's do it.
I agree with you. I think that's part of the lessons learned and the history, and it would be really constructive. And yes, Andrea, I'd love to talk about sort of prospects for European security going forward. But thank you to both of you for such a great conversation and for all the work you've done over the years to keep people so well informed on these really important issues.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.